For 30 years, the entire world had the face of a 5,000-year-old man wrong. Not slightly wrong, not a minor detail off. Wrong in his skin color, wrong in his eyes, wrong in his hair, and wrong about where his ancestors actually came from. Millions of people walked through museums, watched documentaries, and read textbooks that showed them a fictional version of one of the most famous human beings ever discovered. And almost nobody knew it. In 2023, a team of scientists went back into his genetic code with better tools. And what they found didn't just update a few facts. It rewrote him. His name is Ötzi, and his story begins in September of 1991, high in the Ötztal Alps on the border between Italy and Austria. Two German hikers, Helmut and Ötzi the Iceman, were walking off the marked trail near a mountain pass called Teisenjoch, more than 3,000 meters above sea level, when Helmut looked down into a channel of meltwater and saw something strange protruding from the ice. As they moved closer, the shape resolved into a human head, then shoulders, then a torso, locked into the glacier. At first, local authorities assumed they were dealing with a modern mountaineering accident. They were not even close. What the Simons had stumbled onto was the naturally mummified body of a Copper Age man, frozen and preserved for roughly 5,300 years. He would come to be known as Ötzi, named for the valley where he was found, and he would become the oldest known glacier mummy in Europe, and one of the most intensively studied human remains in the history of science. What followed his discovery was one of the most extraordinary scientific investigations ever conducted on a single human body. Ötzi was transferred to the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, in northern Italy, where he remains today inside a custom climate-controlled chamber kept at -6 degrees Celsius and 99% humidity, conditions designed to mimic the glacier that preserved him for millennia. CT scans conducted in the early 2000s revealed a flint arrowhead lodged in his left shoulder, finally answering the question of how he died, violently, in a confrontation somewhere in those mountains. The equipment found with his body turned out to be the most complete Copper Age personal kit ever recovered anywhere on Earth. A bearskin cap, a deerskin coat, a woven grass cloak, goatskin leggings, shoes with bearskin soles, a copper axe with a blade that was 99.7% pure copper, traced through isotope analysis back to ore sources in central Italy, a flint dagger, a yew longbow, a quiver of arrows, a wood frame backpack, and across his skin, 61 tattoos, mostly simple lines and crosses positioned near his joints and along his lower back, which some researchers believe may have served a therapeutic purpose, an ancient form of pain treatment. But the most consequential chapter of Ötzi's story wasn't written by archaeologists studying his tools. It was written by geneticists studying his DNA. In 2012, scientists achieved something that had never been done before. They sequenced the complete genome of a mummy. The results, published in Nature Communications, were treated as a landmark. And the picture they painted of Ötzi shaped how the entire world saw him for more than a decade. That 2012 analysis described a man with light skin, light eyes, and a full head of hair. Museums built reconstructions around that image. Documentaries recreated his face using it. Textbooks printed it. For 10 years, when people pictured the Iceman, they pictured a man who looked, more or less, like a modern Central European. That image was almost entirely wrong. In August of 2023, a research team led by Ku Wang, working alongside senior researchers Johannes Kraus, director of the Department of Archaeogenetics at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, and Albert Zink, head of the Institute for Mummy Studies at URAC Research in Bolzano, the very institution that houses Ötzi's body, published a new analysis in the journal Cell Genomics. This wasn't a casual second look. It was a complete resequencing of Ötzi's genome using far more advanced technology than existed in 2012. Achieving over 15 times deeper average genetic coverage with dramatically lower contamination. And that word, contamination, is the key to understanding why the original 2012 picture was so far off. The 2012 sequencing wasn't fraudulent or careless. It was simply a product of its time. Ancient DNA science in the early 2010s was still developing the tools needed to reliably separate authentic 5,000-year-old genetic material from modern human DNA that had inevitably worked its way into the sample over decades of handling, storage, and study. Every researcher, every visitor, every piece of equipment that had ever come near Ötzi's remains had the potential to leave behind trace genetic material. And the 2012 methods simply couldn't filter all of it out. By 2023, sequencing technology and contamination control protocols had advanced enough to do dramatically better. And when the team applied those newer, cleaner methods, a very different man emerged from the data. The first major correction concerned his skin. The 2023 study concluded that Ötzi had noticeably darker skin than any previous reconstruction had shown, far closer to the dark, weathered appearance of the mummy itself than to the light-skinned figure from 2012. For years, the explanation for the mummy's dark coloring had been that his tissue darkened over thousands of years of glacial preservation. The new genetic evidence suggests that explanation was backwards. Ötzi likely already had dark skin in life. Johannes Krauss put it simply when asked about the finding. The mummy itself is dark, and that darkness may be far closer to how he actually looked than anyone assumed. The second correction involved his eyes. The refined genome pointed to a brown-eyed phenotype, not the blue or hazel eyes shown in the earlier reconstructions. Researchers have suggested this earlier error likely traces back to the same contamination problem. Since modern populations from northern Italy, the very population most likely to have contributed contaminating DNA to the 2012 sample, carry blue and hazel eyes at notably higher rates than the broader human population. Strip out that contamination, and the eye color changes along with it. The third correction was his hair, or rather, his lack of it. The 2023 genome revealed that Ötzi carried a genetic predisposition toward androgenic alopecia, the biological basis of male pattern baldness. He died at roughly 45 years old, an age by which that predisposition, on the evidence available, would likely have already produced significant hair loss. For years, the mummy's hairless scalp had been chalked up to post-mortem decay during more than 5,000 years in the ice. The genetic evidence now suggests a simpler explanation. He may have already been substantially bald while he was alive. Skin, eyes, and hair together represent a genuine overhaul of what the most photographed prehistoric man in the world actually looked like. But the fourth finding from the 2023 paper is, in some ways, the most scientifically significant of all, because it isn't just about Ötzi's face. It's about where his ancestors came from, and what that tells us about how Europe itself was populated. To understand why this matters, it helps to know the broader framework that modern ancient DNA research has built for European population history. Today's Europeans descend from a blending of three major ancestral groups. The first were the Western hunter-gatherers, the population that had lived across the continent for tens of thousands of years before agriculture ever arrived, generally understood to have had darker skin and blue eyes. The second were the Anatolian early farmers, who began migrating into Europe from what is now Turkey roughly 8,000 years ago, bringing agriculture, livestock, and pottery with them, and who gradually spread across much of the continent, mixing with the hunter-gatherer populations they encountered. The third wave arrived far later and far more suddenly. Around 4,900 years ago, pastoralist populations from a Eurasian steppe, now generally referred to as the Yamnaya in the genetic literature, moved westward into Europe, bringing horses, wheeled transport, and the linguistic roots that would eventually give rise to the Indo-European language family. The original 2012 sequencing of Ötzi appeared to show detectable steppe herder ancestry in his genome, a striking result at the time, since it implied that steppe populations had already reached deep into the Italian Alps by his lifetime, earlier than most models suggested. The 2023 resequencing overturned that finding entirely. The corrected, high-coverage genome shows no detectable steppe ancestry in Ötzi whatsoever. According to the research team, that earlier signal appears to have been another artifact of contamination, since the modern populations most likely to have contributed contaminating DNA carry substantial steppe ancestry themselves, which had bled into the older, noisier dataset. What the cleaned-up genome shows instead is striking. Ötzi carried more than 92% Anatolian farmer ancestry, a proportion higher than any other known European individual from the same period whose genome has been sequenced. Most Copper Age Europeans, by that point, carried a blend of Anatolian farmer ancestry mixed with hunter-gatherer and, increasingly, steppe ancestry. Ötzi's community had almost none of that mixing. Whatever population he came from had remained remarkably close to the genetic profile of the original Anatolian farmers who had entered Europe some 8,000 years earlier, more than 3,000 years before his death. The implication researchers have drawn from this is that the alpine valleys of what is now northern Italy functioned, in the Copper Age, as something like a genetic refuge. A population of Anatolian-descended farmers appears to have settled there and remained substantially isolated for millennia, while populations elsewhere in Europe were mixing extensively with hunter-gatherers and, later, incoming steppe herders. The mountains that we typically think of as barriers to travel and trade appear to have also been barriers to gene flow. People on different sides of the Alps were, genetically speaking, living increasingly separate lives, and Ötzi's community, on the far side of that barrier, remained one of the most genetically distinct populations anywhere in Europe at the time of his death. It's worth being clear about what the 2023 findings did not change. Ötzi's age, his cause of death, his cultural context, and the archaeological significance of his equipment are untouched by this research. He is still the same roughly 45-year-old man who died from an arrow wound to the shoulder in the High Alps around 5,300 years ago. He is still the man buried with the most complete Copper Age toolkit ever found. What changed is narrower and, in a way, more human, what he actually looked like, and where his deepest ancestral roots trace back to. This is, in fact, a early clean example of how mainstream peer-reviewed science is supposed to work. The 2012 findings weren't dishonest. They were limited by the technology available at the time, technology that the scientific community openly acknowledged was still developing. As that technology improved, researchers went back, redid the work with better tools, and published a correction in a peer-reviewed journal. The record updated itself. The new study also uncovered other details about Ötzi's biology worth mentioning. His genome carries variants associated with an elevated risk for obesity and type 2 diabetes, conditions that researchers believe likely never expressed themselves during his lifetime, probably because his physically demanding alpine lifestyle and diet kept those genetic predispositions from ever being triggered. That finding fits into a broader pattern that ancient DNA research has revealed elsewhere. Many of the genetic variants linked to modern lifestyle diseases were already present in early agricultural populations thousands of years ago. It was the arrival of modern diets and sedentary living, not new mutations, that eventually let those old predispositions express themselves. The 2023 analysis also confirmed that Ötzi was lactose intolerant, entirely consistent with what's known about early European farming populations, since the genetic mutation allowing adults to digest milk sugar didn't become widespread in Europe until well after his lifetime, largely following the later steppe migrations that brought dairy-based herding into the continent. Put it all together, and the corrected Ötzi is, in many ways, a more complete and more interesting figure than the one the public spent a decade believing in. A man of around 45, from a community descended almost entirely from Anatolian farmers who had settled in the Alps and remained isolated there for over 4,000 years. Dark-skinned, brown-eyed, likely balding, carrying genetic risk factors for modern metabolic disease that his own active lifestyle kept in check. Lactose intolerant, equipped with an extraordinary personal kit, including a nearly pure copper axe whose raw material had traveled to him from central Italy through long-distance trade networks, marked with 61 tattoos that may have eased chronic pain, and killed by an arrow in the mountains at the end of a summer or the start of an autumn, roughly 5,300 years ago. What this case also exposes is a familiar problem in how science reaches the public. The 2012 reconstruction had over a decade to embed itself in museum exhibits, television documentaries, and school textbooks before the correction ever arrived. Corrected findings, even well-publicized ones, rarely spread as fast or as far as the original story did. Many people picture Ötzi today exactly as he was drawn in 2012, pale-skinned, light-eyed, a full head of hair, because that image simply got there first and had years to settle into public memory. The South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology has been working with the Max Planck Institute and URAC Research to update its public-facing materials to reflect the corrected science, and newer artistic reconstructions now depict the darker-skinned, balding, brown-eyed man the 2023 genome actually supports. But the update is, by nature, slower than the original headline was. Helmut Simon, the hiker who found Ötzi in 1991, never lived to see any of this. He died in a separate accident in the Alps in 2004, in the middle of a long legal dispute over recognition for his discovery, and was eventually awarded roughly €175,000 by the Italian government in 2003 for finding what would become one of the most studied individual human beings in the history of archaeology. He never saw the corrected face of the man he pulled out of the ice. The mummy in Bolzano hasn't changed. He's still there, in the same climate-controlled chamber, at the same temperature and humidity, with the same arrowhead in his shoulder and the same 61 tattoos on his skin. What changed is our understanding of him, built on better technology applied to the same 5,000-year-old evidence. That's really the whole story here. Not a scandal, not a cover-up, just science doing what it's supposed to do, getting closer to the truth, one resequencing at a time.